Good afternoon or good morning, ladies and gentlemen, whenever you're deciding to watch this. Hopefully, you are all fine. Hopefully, you're great. We're going to kind of jump into it just because I don't want to make these too long for you, but just understanding environmental science and what are we talking about? Well, what's the whole big deal behind it? Today, we're really getting into we're going to be talking about the history behind environmental science, some of the key fundamental aspects of it, and how the thought or idea about protecting, even though it sounds obvious, the protection of the environment and who started and why that's important. All right. So today we're looking at a little bit of history, and as you're going to see, you're going to have your own assignment given out on next week, which we kind of talk about these things. But just kind of an introduction. Humans have always inhabited both the natural world and the social world, right? Environmental science deals with humans. 50% of the topic is humans and how we interact with the other 50%, which is the environment. And humans are a social creature, and we also inhabit the natural world. So we have to talk about both. When we use the word environment, it means the circumstances or conditions that surround an organism or group of organisms, right? What is surrounding them? What affects them? The complex of social and cultural conditions that affect an individual or community, right? The things that between the group of species, how they interact with each other, then may have impacts on their environment around them. So, environmental science is a systematic study of our environment and our proper place in it. As stated, it's very interdisciplinary, right? We're going to talk about many topics here: political science, sociology, urban planning, engineering, economics, and so on. I could go on and on and on, just mathematics as well, right? We're going to talk about religion sometimes in this class, but it's integrative. We have the natural sciences, we have the social sciences, and we talk about the humanities. In AP, it's kind of considered a science, but just know in IB, it's actually in between the social sciences and the hard sciences, which is kind of interesting. We're the only subject that really does that because you have to take into account all these different things to put them together. You need the science, you need the social, and then you kind of have to bring them together to understand what's occurring. So there is no fine place to put it. Environmental science. That's why a lot of people enjoy it, because it's not just simply science. It's these over-encompassing ideas and big thoughts. And then currently, why is this important? Well, human population, number one. We're roughly at 7.7 billion people on this planet. 7.7 billion. And as we're going to learn from our population unit, it's expected to rise to about anywhere between 10 to 14 billion. So we're not done yet. But just know that's a big factor. We just have so many people on this planet that obviously has a direct effect on it, right? It has effect on water, food, climate change and energy, air pollution, pollution in general, and biodiversity loss in most of it, right? Water quantity and quality issues may be the most critical issues in the 21st century. Can't understate that enough. There might be in the future water wars, and we'll talk about that. Food is absolutely inequitable. Food is not distributed evenly across the planet is another way of saying it, right? If I could get, stop the tongue twister. Food is there. We actually currently make enough food or enough calories on this planet to feed everybody, but we also know that there's nearly almost a billion people that are starving right now. Why? Just because land use is different in many countries. Some countries can't produce food, some can produce way more, and then just getting it to each other is a very difficult task. Obviously, we'll talk about global climate change and energy with the burning of fossil fuels, absolutely critical. Pollution, in this we kind of talk about air pollution, but we'll also talk about water pollution, is how that's affecting biodiversity, and just species are absolutely getting destroyed with humanity and the way we are actually doing things right now. So those are our big kind of things we'll talk about. But there are signs of hope. As you're going to see, this class is kind of depressing sometimes. I would say more depressing than good, just because the world is in such a dire strait. But there are some good signs. Population is starting to stabilize. Where once we saw it going almost directly up, it's now starting to hit that curve. Hopefully, it'll begin to stabilize. Health. We can now just keep people healthy longer, and babies are less likely to die. So we're making a lot of health fronts. We're starting to actually, well, habitat conservation can be discussed, but we're at least starting to see the importance of saving habitats. We are starting to grow renewable energy. Now that can be argued fast enough, we don't know. And then there's some international cooperation as well, give or take once again. But there is signs that there are countries that want to work with each other. When we talk about environmental science from a historical perspective, we really kind of break it down to 4 distinct stages. There's a pragmatic resource conservation stage, a moral and aesthetic nature preservation, and then we start getting into more of a concern about health and ecological damage. And then now we're kind of in the global environmental citizenship stage, where we now know what's happening in the Amazon is affecting us here. What's happening in the Sahara is affecting us here. We're more of a global understanding now. And they're not mutually exclusive, right? That you can't completely break them down, but parts of each persist today in the environmental movement. So it's not like we've given up on just the moral and aesthetic preservation of nature. No, obviously we have organizations like PETA that are very moral, or at least go on the more moral front in protecting animals, right? So we do still see them all currently. Some key historical figures. George Perkins Marsh. George Perkins Marsh, he published Man in Nature, published in 1864. This was one of the first volumes that really spoke about man and humanity and how we deal with nature. One of the first published or widespread novels that kind of came about. And this influenced Theodore Roosevelt, who you can say is probably one of the most popular U.S. presidents, and probably one of the most influential people to really kind of talk about saving nature. Theodore Roosevelt was a president, at the turn of the century. Gifford Pinchot, who was his conservation advisor, who also went on to do great things for environment. And they kind of talked about pragmatic utilitarian, man, I can never speak, conservation, but I'm really speaking on the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time, right? And they kind of really affected multiple use policies of the United States Forestry Service, and really they were kind of influential in regards to the United States for really making a foundation or creating an environment where there was people in the political spectrum that were now taking the environment into context. This was kind of the first time. And then, as you can see, other countries kind of followed suit, even Thailand in regards to this. Then we have John Muir, who is the president of the Sierra Club, which is still around today and does great benefits to the environment. But nature deserves to exist for its own sake, regardless of degree of usefulness to humans. So he was kind of a biocentric preservation kind of idea, where now kind of before this it was kind of more about what can nature do for humans. He was kind of the first one where why doesn't it have its own life to live, or its own need for itself, not just humans, right? Then we had Aldo Leopold, wrote a Sand County Almanac and the Land Ethic, and he stated, "We abuse the land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." So once again, it's kind of more of a thing where before this it was, what could humans get out of nature? Now the kind of thinking kind of changed to, we are a part of nature. And that moves into the further historical people we'll talk about. But here's just here's pictures of them. And obviously throughout history it's a bunch of white guys, right? But that's not necessarily true. These are just some of the people in the past that have gotten recognition for it, or in trying to save the environment. And as you're going to see in your own work, that it wasn't just these gentlemen. There were a lot of people from many different backgrounds that have had you know, um, influential help, or at least they've had an influential sense about protecting the environment. One such one was Rachel Carlson, who wrote Silent Spring, which completely it was kind of this where it really popularized within pop culture about the protection of environment. The industrial expansion after World War II added new concerns to the environmental agenda. After World War II, the United States hit kind of a boom, and the world hit a boom where just industrialization kind of occurred. Well, this industrialization came at the cost of the environment, and this is where Rachel Carlson awakened the public to the environmental threat posed by pesticides in her book Silent Spring, which talked about DDT. And this. Just think of this. Look at this picture. This is DDT, or a high cancer-causing compound that would kill mosquitoes, but the government really took no thought about the environment, or in this case even human health, right? Because as you can see, no care walking within this chemical, which can absolutely kill you. And we'll talk about Rachel Carlson quite a bit more. Modern media now allows for increased international communication. Local and regional environmental leaders increasingly have a worldwide impact, right? So now it's becoming more of a globalized world that we live in. So now what's happening in one part of the country is affecting the rest of the world. But we're going to really speak on this. It's a divided world. World Bank estimates that there are more than 1.4 billion people living in extreme poverty, earning less than $1 per day. Think about that. 1.4 billion people. So about a sixth of the world's population is in extreme poverty, living off less than $1 per day. Insanity. Poor are often both victim and agents of environmental degradation, meaning they have to bear the brunt of most of the breakdown in environmental problems. We're going to talk about Africa quite a bit. Africa is unfortunately a country that has some of the world's most poor people, but at the same time it's getting the hardest hit by global climate change. So they're being greatly affected by it. So it actually makes the system in the future, the system is going to be harder and harder for them to even get out of that. But also, in this statement, it also says, the poor often cause a lot of environmental impact. Well, think about it like this. You can yell at them, help the environment, but answer this question. I'll bring this up quite a bit. Are you going to think about the environment when your family is starving, right? Are you going to not go hunt that endangered species when your family is starving? These are things to consider, right? So a cycle of poverty continues over generations as people who are malnourished and ill cannot work productively and raise healthy children. So the cycle just continues and continues. And then kind of going into those are the have-nots. What about the haves? 1% of America accounts for 40% of the wealth. Think about that. 1% control about half of the wealth in the country. So wealth versus income. Or wealth, what's the difference, right? Obviously, there are some Americans who control vast amounts, and this is on a global. AP is just more of an American curriculum, but just know, I would say that's probably even more so in Thailand. I guarantee the 1% probably own more than 40% of their share, or roughly about the same amount. So, give or take. So what we're getting at is there's a few people that control a lot more of the income and wealth of the world. About 1/5 of the world's population lives in countries with per capita income greater than $25,000 per year. So about 1/5 we consider the haves. And gap between rich and poor continues to increase. The poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer. And that's a problem. If you were to break up the U.S. land divided by health, 1% of the population would own that much, 9% that. So it just gives you kind of a breakdown of roughly 10% of the population. If you take this 9% plus 1%, owns this much of the United States in regards to wealth. The rest own these type of land, and 40% would only own this little tiny sliver down there. If you can't see the red dot down there, it's insane. So obviously wealth is divided unfairly on this planet. Um, and this just affects quality of life indicators, poverty, life expectancy, adult literacy. Be having money and not having money affects all of these things. You can say, as you know, I'm a big, when it gets down to it, this is just not to talk politics, but I'm a big capitalist, right? If you work hard for your money, you should be able to get more, right? I'm not disagreeing with that, but the problem is there's already an unfair playing field, right? There are children being born into families that they will never have a chance to get out of it because they just are so far behind. Their family can't afford to send them to read, to become educated. So it's unfair how how we do this in a global sense. And is there enough for anyone? This is kind of the last slide, but rich nations consume an inordinate share of the world's resources and produce an unsustainable amount of pollution. The U.S. makes up only 4.6% of the world's population, but consumes 25% of all oil and generates 50% of all toxic waste in the world. Insane. Now that's gone down. I think 50% it's probably more like 40% because now China has actually surpassed the United States. So do know that it's changing, but it's insane between the world's haves and the have-nots. It's an uneven playing field. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop there. Like I said, this first unit is kind of dry, but we will get to it. But think about this and start thinking about these historical figures and maybe start looking into people that you would like to research, because hint, 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 that might be what Thursday's assignment is all about. All right. Take care. Have a great day. And hopefully you're enjoying